Greetings and welcome to the studios of the Community Media Center. I'm Richard Turner and I'm honored to serve as the Executive Director. Thanks for joining us, whether viewing at home on our local cable channels, viewing online, or being here live and in person. Connecting you with the current and topical issues before our community is a critical part of our mission. The Community Media Center provides Carroll County residents and organizations with services, tools, training, and access to innovative digital technologies that engage, inform, and connect them to their community. Now, tonight it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Honorable Charles Harrison. He is a former Orphans Court judge. He served in Vietnam as an Army captain and armed helicopter pilot, having been awarded various medals, including the Bronze Star. He served 28 years in the FBI as a supervisory special agent, FBI assistant inspector, and unit chief. He is the founder of Harrison & Associates, LLC, an investigative and security consulting company. His other community service includes the County Ethics Commission and the National Association of Retired Federal Employees. And tonight he is here in his official capacity as our chairman of the Community Media Center Board of Directors. Charles?
Thank you, Richard. Good evening, and welcome to the Legislative District 5 State Senator and House of Delegates Candidates Forum. I'm Charles Harrison, Chair of the Community Media Center Board of Directors. Tonight's forum is being held at the Community Media Center studio in Westminster, Maryland. The program is being broadcast live on cable channel 19 and 23, as well as on the Community Media Center's website at carrollmediacenter.org. The program will be rebroadcast on cable channel 19 and 23 starting Tuesday, October the 16th. The Community Media Center is partnering with the Carroll County Times to provide this programming as a public service to the community. Our goal is to establish an equal platform for all candidates to provide local residents with information about individuals seeking office in the upcoming general election. At this time, I will turn the program over to our moderator for the evening, Mr. Wayne Carter, editor of the Carroll County Times, to explain the rules and to open tonight's forum. Wayne?
Thank you, Charles. As the moderator for this evening, I'll first introduce each one of our candidates. Each candidate will then have 2 minutes for an opening statement. Following the forum introductions, I will ask the first question. Each candidate will then have 2 minutes to respond to that question. All candidates will be asked an identical question. Just to be clear, there will be no debate. This is an informational forum. At the conclusion of the question and answer period, each candidate will then have 2 minutes to make a summary statement. All responses will be timed, and the timekeeper will give candidates a hand signal when 30 seconds remains. The timekeeper will ring the bell 2 to 3 seconds after the final stop signal is given, and at that point, I may immediately interrupt the candidate and discontinue the statement or answer at that time. Now, the questions tonight will be a mixture of pre-prepared questions, those that were submitted in advance by the public via email, as well as questions from tonight's live audience. Tonight's forum is being recorded, so we ask that everyone please turn off their cell phones or put them on silent. We also ask that attendees please refrain from applause or making noise during the forum or doing anything visible or audible to express support or opposition to any candidate during the forum. All candidates running for House of Delegates and the State Senate in Legislative District 5 were invited to participate in tonight's forum. Delegates Susan Krebs, April Rose, and Haven Shoemaker are not in attendance tonight. With that out of the way, let us begin, and we'll start with House of Delegates candidate, Democrat Emily Shank, to introduce herself.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Carroll County Times and the Community Media Center and those of you watching. My name is Emily Shank, and I am running to represent you in the House of Delegates. The House of Delegates is a legislative body that passes laws in Maryland, and a delegate's job is to represent every single one of their constituents in passing those laws. So let me share with you my vision. I envision a future where we address our opioid fight by increasing mental health care, where everyone has access to health care. I envision a future where our schools are fully funded and we seize every opportunity to make them world-class. A world where small business can thrive and so can their employees. And most importantly, I envision a world where the tribalism and partisan dysfunction is a thing of the past, and we work together and we reach across the aisle. And I'll tell you, in my future that I envision, that starts with term limits. And so I have pledged to only serving 2 terms in the House of Delegates, but more so, I will introduce legislation and I will fight to make that a law. Now, my vision distinguishes me from the other candidates in this race, and their absence is telling. They don't think that they need to be here because they are certain they will be reelected simply because they are Republicans. Well, let me tell you, that is the exact tribalism and division that is tearing our country apart. Not only are they fostering it, they're counting on it. So for my part, tonight, I look forward to answering your questions and earning your vote so we can break that Annapolis machine and work together. Thank you.
Okay. Next up is State Senate candidate, Democrat Jamie Omar.
Hi, I'm Jamie Omar, and I'm running for State Senate. If you told me, I don't know, 5 years ago that I'd be running for anything as a Democrat, I would have laughed at you, because like many of you, I grew up as a Carroll County Republican. Lately, the Republican Party has ceased to be the party of intelligent spending and fiscal responsibility and has started to become something else that I don't recognize. So I jumped ship from being an independent to being a Democrat. And I noticed that nobody was running for the Democratic office of State Senate. And I thought this was not an opportunity to let waste. So I put my name on the ballot, and here I am giving you a Democratic option for State Senate.
Okay, thank you. And now State Senator Republican Justin Reedy.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you to the Community Media Center for hosting us tonight, and those of you watching and also attending, we're thankful that you're paying attention to what's happening, because this is a very pivotal election in the future of our state. My name is Justin Reedy, and I've been honored to serve the last almost 4 years as your state senator. I actually was a member of the House of Delegates for 4 years and was reelected and then appointed early in this term to fill the seat that was left by Senator Joe Getty, who joined the Hogan administration. So I've been the state senator here for almost a full term, but this will actually be the first time that I'm asking for your vote for state senate. And I wanted to just share briefly in my opening statement a little about myself. My wife, Ruth, and I live in Manchester, Maryland. We have 2 children. Caleb is almost 3, and my daughter, Brooklyn, is 6.5. In my real job, because state legislator is a part-time job, my real job, I work in marketing, advertising, and sales, and have really just loved growing up in Carroll County since my family moved here when I was 11. When I first ran for office, I ran because, like so many of you, I was concerned about the direction of our state. I ran for office in 2010, actually, and was so concerned about the way that we've made our state. Our state is not a place where families can afford to live, retirees can afford to stay, or that businesses can thrive. But over the last 4 years working with Governor Hogan, we've seen tremendous progress in jobs being created, making it easier to do business in the state of Maryland, making it a more family-friendly place. But there's still so much work to be done. I look forward tonight to talking about the clear choice we face in this election, not just the clear choice between the candidates here, but also the clear choice between the governor's election as well, between Governor Hogan and Ben Jealous. So look forward to the conversation tonight and to answering questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. All right, the first question, a simple one, but probably not an easy one. We'll start with Ms. Shank for this one. What is the most significant issue that you believe is facing the state of Maryland today, and if elected, what would you do to address it?
Well, you're right, that is a tough one. I think there are actually 2 significant issues that are facing us right now: healthcare and education. And we can address both of them. Healthcare, we can create universal healthcare in Maryland. We have a unique system where we already have the tools in place based on certain laws that we have, and they're far too complex and for me to get into in a 2-minute time frame. So, but we can create that universal health care. The reason that's so important is because we are fighting an opioid epidemic, and we've done some great things to address that opioid epidemic, but the piece that is missing is mental health treatment. We know that addiction is a mental health issue, and yet we are gutting our health care at the same time that we are having an addiction crisis. And so it is imperative that we address our health care in Maryland. We also have the opportunity to address our schools. In Carroll County, for years, we have been jumping up and down, asking for more money under the Thornton formula. And now, with the possibility of the Kirwan Commission, we have the opportunity to have a seat at the table to fight for the specific things that Kirwan recommends that will benefit Carroll County and benefit our kids, and then we can get the money for it. And so I think those two things are the ones that we have to address in moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Omar?
I'm really glad you brought up the Kirwan Commission because I was going to talk about that in my response. For those of you who don't know, the Kirwan Commission is a commission that is put together to figure out what we can do to make education in Maryland more excellent, and they have several recommendations, and one of those is poverty alleviation or targeting students who are at risk, which is why I want to bring up, as well as targeting our education, a higher minimum wage for the state of Maryland. That's the thing that I think we really need to fight for in this upcoming legislative season. Starting in 2019, the minimum wage for the state of Maryland is due to go up to only $11 an hour. And there's very few places in the state where you can actually afford to live on $11 an hour. So I've allied myself with the Fight for 15, which is the $15 hour minimum wage. It's very important, and it will tie into all kinds of things, including the poverty alleviation in our schools, because people who are not making a living wage cannot afford to send their children to schools with full bellies. They cannot afford to spend time with their children because they have to work multiple jobs. And let's also talk about teachers who are working multiple jobs because they aren't making anything close to a living wage. So I'd like to see our living wage in the state of Maryland go up. Sorry, not our living wage. I'd like to see our minimum wage in the state of Maryland go up closer to a living wage.
Okay, thank you. Senator Reedy.
Thank you. Yeah, it is tough to answer that question in 2 minutes. There are so many issues. And I actually agree with my friends here on the stage about education being critically important. The Kirwan Commission certainly is a major policy decision that the General Assembly will have to make in the next session and the governor will have to make in the next session. Obviously, the opioid crisis continues to rage in our county and in our state and nationwide. All of those things are important, and the way that we tackle those issues are very important. We certainly want to see us continue to get extra help and more help for Carroll County as it relates to education funding. At the same time, some of the things that come out of something like the Kirwan Commission will be a lot of recommendations for pretty exciting but pie-in-the-sky ideas. And where will the money come from, and will it actually be able to address the problem that a county like Carroll and many other suburban and rural counties have? I say all that to say I think the big issue that we face moving forward is how we're going to view the role of government and your tax dollars in tackling these different issues. What's the balancing act between saying we're for health care for all, but we don't know how we're going to pay for it? We don't know whether the model of Medicare for all would make sense from a cost perspective or from actually covering people. You hear a lot of those kind of ideas that are thrown around as if there's no downside to them, or that there's no counter to it. The truth is the big issue facing Maryland is going to be how the decision makers in the next 4 years, from governor to attorney general to state senate to House of Delegates, view the role of government in your daily life versus your view of that. And I tend to believe that we need more economic freedom and choice in our state. So I think all of those issues a lot of those issues fall under what's the role of government in solving these problems and what's the role of us working together to allow more private sector ingenuity to solve those problems. So there's definitely a lot to discuss tonight. It is hard to answer that question in 2 minutes. Wow, I exhausted my 2 minutes very quickly.
Well, hopefully I'll give you an opportunity to expand on a little bit of that. All of you brought up education in that round, so I think that segues nicely into the next question. And we'll start with Ms. Omar for this one, and we'll just move down the panel as we go. What do you believe can and should be done regarding bringing more state funding to Carroll County for the public school system?
I think that Carroll County has more at-risk students than we are currently being funded for. And as we take the recommendations of the Kirwan Commission, that we will receive more funding specifically for those students who need it the most.
Okay, thank you. Senator Reedy.
Well, first of all, there's sort of a premise in that question that says that we haven't gotten money, more money lately, and I'm not saying you mean it with the premise of that question, but I have noticed in the debate back in the primary and other times, there's this discussion that somehow there's just been no effort and nothing's happened. The truth is we've actually gotten millions and millions of dollars that we did not quote unquote deserve in the last 4 years. Our delegation has worked very closely with Governor Hogan, certainly, but also across the aisle. I was able to develop a very wonderful friendship and partnership with a Baltimore City senator who was on the Budget Committee in the Senate, and we actually were able to help each other's jurisdictions out because Baltimore City and us had the same issue of losing enrollments, which means we lose money from the state, but the way that we lose the money is very quickly. So there's no smoothing to make sure that there's time for you to acclimate for the fact that you've lost students. You can't just shut a bunch of schools down all at once. You can't. There's a lot of things you cannot do just in a year or two that take time. So we actually were able to work, and I credit Governor Hogan for signing legislation that actually Delegate Krebs was the author of the legislation. I had the legislation in the Senate side. Our whole delegation supported it and worked together across party lines to get it done to where there would be extra funding available every year until Thornton ran out. Kerwin Commission coming along, their recommendations, as again, as I said, sound great. And Jamie was referring to the recommendation about helping at-risk children, which obviously I don't think anybody in their right mind would disagree with, of course. The problem is how they define that means that there's more money available for jurisdictions that have a higher level of poverty. But Carroll County really does not right now, the way the formulas work and the way that it seems like Kerwin's projecting them to work, Carroll County would not a lot of times meet some of those baselines. So we would miss out on extra funding. So figuring out how within the current framework and structure we can get more help for the county is important, but also finally stimulating growth in our county so we can get more families to move here, to stay here, to have kids. That will help us long term too, because then we'll have more children in the school system. So it's complex, but I think it's a very important issue.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Shank.
So as far as bringing more funding back to Carroll County, one thing that we can do at a state level is we can actually fix the fund and create the lockbox. The revenues that were generated by the casinos that were supposed to be additional money for school funding that never ended up being secured in a lockbox, safe, separate account is something that is high past time that be done. So that is the first step that needs to be taken. Now, Senator Reedy suggests that we've gotten more money, and that is fantastic, but that doesn't mean it's enough. Our teachers went 7 years without a raise. 7 years. These are already professionals who work incredibly long hours, who give emotionally, physically, who buy supplies with their own money, and then are so underpaid that they have to end up going to Baltimore County or to Howard County. 7 years without a raise. That is unacceptable. And so while the Kerwin Commission outlines many ideas, and certainly it would be pie in the sky to suggest that every jurisdiction adopt every suggestion or recommendation. What's not pie in the sky is to suggest that teachers be treated like professionals and be given a pay that is commensurate to that. And then hold them accountable. With that additional money comes additional standards. And so I think between Kerwin and the lockbox, we can see real improvements here in Carroll County.
Okay, thank you. Senator Reedy, we'll start with you on this one, and just kind of a follow-up question to something you had just mentioned. What role do you believe state legislators should have in trying to stimulate the local economy here in Carroll County, and how would you propose doing so?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think number one, the crushing tax burden and high cost of living in our entire state is a very big impediment to keeping young families here. It's also an impediment to keeping retirees here who end up funding a lot of the things that we do need, like our schools with property tax and other things. So, I mean, one role that we have played, and I've certainly tried to play in the state Senate, is being a real champion for seeing us not just talking about just tax cuts necessarily, but even ways that we add regulations onto how people create jobs, the small businesses, and trying to find a way, as Governor Hogan's done very well, to relieve. What Governor Hogan's looking to do has done is cut out fees that were being used as these slush funds. The previous administration raised a whole bunch of fees artificially, didn't call them a tax, called them fees. but then they would take the extra money. It was a fee that was assigned to a certain agency of the state, like the tire disposal fund, and they would raise the fee for getting rid of your tire, but then they would take the extra money out of the fund and put it in the general fund. Well, what Governor Hogan's done is to, within his power, he's eliminated some of those fees or at least reduced them. We've tried to get more tax relief passed through the General Assembly. It's been difficult. We've been able to relieve a little bit of the burden on retirees, but really only been able to focus on military and first responders. I'd like to see us make retirement income be as close to tax-free as possible and reduce the tax burden on working families. I think that would help. That would help us with stimulating job growth, with keeping people here, again, with attracting and keeping more families with children, which is really part of the challenge of trying to grow and build our community. And again, it goes back, whatever happens with all the school formulas, it will be fundamentally based on how many kids you have in your school system, as it should be. You shouldn't get paid for students that aren't there. So, you know, all of this ties together in my view, and I think that is a big role that state legislators can do. I don't think it's the state's job to pick winners and losers and subsidize certain industries over others. I think it's much better for us to just relieve the tax burden on everybody.
Okay. Ms. Shank.
I am the daughter of a small business owner. I am also the daughter of a member of a labor union. When we look at how often the rhetoric around this is discussed, we talk about pitting business against labor and the legislation that comes down around that. And I reject that idea. I think that we can advocate and make things work for small business at the same time that we are lifting up the values of labor and unions that end up benefiting us all. And I'll give you a case in point. Last year, there was a bill that was passed actually as a veto override. And this bill had a very good goal. The goal was to give employees paid time off, paid sick leave. The problem is, my party made the mistake of not bringing small business to the table, of equating small business and big business and just calling them business. So Walmart is treated the same as the guy who owns the pizza shop, and that's just not fair. So that law is what we shouldn't do. Now, just recently, I read an article that Governor Hogan is extending parental leave time for state employees. And he is encouraging small businesses to do the same by offering a tax incentive. I commend the governor for this. This is how we bring those two ideas together. This is how we advocate for a living wage, for paid time off, and yet do it without doing it on the backs of small business because we've brought them to the table to help make it work for them.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Omar.
So to a certain extent, those of us who are in the state legislature, we do not directly influence everything that goes on here at the county level. Anything that we pass as a state law obviously affects the entire state. And sometimes that doesn't give us the granularity that we need to help out our specific counties. For instance, one of the things that I think we could use more of here in Carroll County to help those families is more affordable housing. There are affordable housing laws that we could pass across the board, but that wouldn't apply to every single county in the same way, and it would affect every county in a different way. So to a certain extent, those ordinances and stuff need to be passed at the county level. So when you ask me how I think those of us in the state legislature can affect the economy of this county, I think to a certain extent, not all of that is in our hands. That being said, I'd like to see also some tax breaks on working families, and I'd also like to see more affordable housing in this county and throughout the state.
Okay, thank you. All right, for this next question, we'll start with Ms. Shank again. And this question was emailed in from a woman in Westminster, and I believe Ms. Omar brought this up earlier. Please define the phrase living wage and what it means to you and what you believe is the best way to ensure full-time workers in Maryland earn a living wage.
That's an excellent question, and I'm really glad that this writer phrased it that way. So a living wage, and there's actually a calculator that MIT came up with, is the wage that you need to earn per hour, depending on how many working adults are in your household and how many dependents are in your household. Now, I was playing around one day because I was curious, and if you go onto MIT's living wage calculator in Carroll County for a 2-parent working household with 2 kids, $15 is the living wage. Now, here's the thing, though. It's not the same in Montgomery County, and that probably doesn't surprise anyone. It's not the same in Frederick, or in Cecil, or in Allegheny, or in Baltimore City. It's going to be different depending on where you live. And so, again, I think as we look at this balance that I talk about between labor and business, first we have to acknowledge that instituting one living wage across the state is probably not helpful or realistic. But narrowing it more appropriately for the local jurisdictions, and then bringing small business to the table so that we can find a way to implement it so that it is not overburdensome, because you don't want to have business that can't hire the next employee because of this. That doesn't help, or has to lay people off. So we find ways through tax credits or other forgiveness programs to make business able to do this. And I think that would be the best approach.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Omar.
Hey, I think Emily did a very good job of defining living wage, so I'm going to let that stand. I do have to disagree that living wage should not be instituted across the state. There is a difference between a minimum wage and a living wage. A living wage is, as Emily defined, the amount that it costs for any family with a certain number with working adults or dependents to live in a specific place. Minimum wage is what is legally required for payment. And I think it makes sense to raise the minimum wage to what is an average working wage in our state, an average living wage in our state, which is about $15 an hour. Living wage, minimum wage was always supposed to be a living wage. It simply hasn't risen with the times or the cost of living or the cost of housing. That being said, our current minimum wage in the state of Maryland is something like $10.10 an hour and is slated to go up to $11 an hour by 2019. I think that's it. So it doesn't all have to happen at once. It can be $15 an hour by 2020, $15 an hour by 2025. I'd just like to get the ball rolling so that we can get the current minimum wage up to what is the average living wage in the state.
Okay, thank you. Senator Reedy.
Thanks. Yeah, I actually think the minimum wage was always, I don't know about the complete history of it, but it's really is intended to be more of a training wage, not necessarily a living wage in my view. But I know the question is about living wage. So let me say, I don't believe it's the government's role to ensure that people have a living wage. I believe in the idea of a social safety net for people who do need help. But the idea that the government is going to be enforcing that you're guaranteed a certain wage or a certain level of income, anytime government has that level of power of the economy, nothing good comes from it. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing everything we can to foster an environment of economic growth and opportunity so that everybody can work to reach their full potential. But the idea of guaranteeing equality means you guarantee mediocrity. I don't think that the government has any role in guaranteeing a living wage. And that's about as fine a point as I can put on it.
Okay. All right, we'll start with Ms. Omar for this one. What do you believe the state's role should be in addressing the opioid epidemic, and do you believe that enough is currently being done? Why or why not?
I actually think the state is doing a pretty good job addressing the opioid epidemic. There can always be more done. I agree with Ms. Shank about providing more funding for mental health care, for inpatient treatment, and all of those things that come with mediating addiction issues. But we've done a really good job of liaising with law enforcement departments and creating legal but not prison alternatives to people who are addicted. And I've seen some good things happening with those in this county specifically, where there are alternative community supports for these issues as opposed to simply housing our addicts in our prisons. And I think we're on a good path in Maryland, and I think we should stay on it.
Okay, thank you. Senator Reedy.
Well, this is clearly, going back to the first question, and when you think about just the human cost, this is clearly the top issue facing our state just from that strict sort of almost triage type of perspective. And clearly all of us, everybody sitting up here and everybody that's watching this is upset, concerned, and in many cases been touched directly by this crisis. I do want to say that I think we've made some tremendous strides. Governor Hogan came into office identifying this as a key priority for his administration. Certainly it was something that over the past several years, myself and my colleagues that represent the county hear more and more and have been involved with more and more, trying to find ways to work with our local state's attorney, our hospitals, our health care providers to find ways that we can deal with this crisis. Fundamentally, we have increased funding pretty dramatically. Up until a couple years ago, one of the big problems, and it still is an issue, is the availability of treatment beds, which we're still a little behind on, frankly, but that does take time to get the physical plant where it needs to be as far as availability for treatment beds. I know there's also in Carroll County something that I'm interested in working more on is I know that there are limited places for women to go that are trying to get out of addiction. That once they've kind of gone through a program, there are not as many sort of safe houses for them to go to as there are that are for men. And so that's an issue that I think we've been working on locally with a lot of partners that we want to continue making progress on. I have to say, no matter how much money you put at this, and I believe this would be one of the things government absolutely should be doing and spending money on. It is a little bit also of a spiritual and personal crisis in our community, and all of us have to do everything we can to reach out to our neighbors, to our friends, to talk to our kids, talk to our grandkids about the dangers of not just all kids know smoking's bad now, but a lot of times they don't know taking that messing around with a pill is bad, or they don't know the dangers at a young level. We're working hard to make that change in the school system to make sure that that kids are hearing about that. But it's a multifaceted problem. It really is, and we have to do better. We just have to do better.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Shank.
So within the past couple weeks, there were 7 overdoses in 48 hours. And I recall that last time we were here, there was a similar scenario. History is repeating itself, and it is unacceptable. Now, we are doing some wonderful things. We have increased our funding, and that allowed us to bring in a special state's attorney to solely work on drug court. And drug court is a phenomenal program. It gives people a second chance. We have worked to have naloxone in our schools and on all of our fire trucks, and all of our police have them. Also, Governor Hogan, I give him credit, he sued the opioid manufacturers and has gone after that. But there's more that we can do, and there's more that we must do, because these solutions, all on their own, will not solve it. It has to come together, and the missing piece is mental health. Because at the end of the day, it is an addiction, which is a mental health issue. And so we have to expand those treatment options. We have to make mental health care accessible to people. We have to come up with other pain alternatives so that it's not just the opioids that doctors are jumping to. So, the things that we're doing are a great start, but it's not enough, and we have to do more.
Okay, thank you. Senator Reed, we'll start with you for this one. Transportation is an issue that can always be a little bit contentious when it comes to funding. What do you think the right balance should be in Maryland between spending money to improve roads and highways versus investing in mass public transportation?
Well, this is an area where I'm just thrilled. I'm thrilled with the change in the dynamic that we've had in the last 4 years. My first 4 years when I was in the House of Delegates, we had a previous administration that really believed that the I-95 corridor and the urbanized area and the urban areas were where we needed to spend almost all of our transportation dollars. And they still get the lion's share now because there's a lot more population there. But what Governor Hogan has done is retooled the focus into making sure that we're improving our road capacity and fixing bridges and improving roads. I don't believe that there should be no funding for mass transit, but what was happening before is only about 30% under the previous governor, only about 30% of the Transportation Trust Fund was going to roads and bridges. Well, we pay our gas tax money. We're driving with gas tax money, paying our tax to the MVA for our titling, our licensing. That needs to be going, the lion's share of that needs to be going to roads. Governor Hogan was right, for example, to spike the red line, which would have been a terrible boondoggle, spending billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars on something that nobody could tell us that many people would even use, and it would have set us back many years. Now we're expanding capacity on highways. I believe that the split of spending closer to 50 to 60 to 70% on roads and then a lesser amount on mass transit is good. As I said, I think there's a role for mass transit, so I'm not saying that, but I think that my perspective is the Transportation Trust Fund being funded by our gas tax dollars, we need to be sure that we're taking care of our roads and bridges first. And in Carroll County, the good news is we've got about $40 million in road projects ongoing right now, and that doesn't count the widening on 32, which is beginning in Howard County but coming this way. So there's a lot of good news on that front, and I would like to continue to see that move forward.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Shank.
I find transportation and people sometimes when they come down on hard lines on it very interesting. Here in Carroll County, Mark and I chose to move to Carroll County. We grew up in Frederick, and we loved the agricultural community. I loved having cows, basically, in my backyard. And that was what was appealing to Carroll County about us. And I understand that we want to keep that. We want to keep that agricultural feel in this county. And transportation is something that plays into that, and so we have to be careful with. My concern is that when we shut off any idea of public transportation and we only provide for roads, we end up with the widening of roads, widening of 26, widening of 32. And I live in that area, and I have to wonder, am I going to be seeing in the next 10, 15 years a 6-lane highway instead of the rolling farms? I don't think that's what we want. Now, the flip side of it is, of course, we have to maintain our roads. That's a safety issue. The roads, bridges, we must maintain them. We must keep them updated. But why we don't consider or we don't talk more openly or aggressively about something like a MARC train for Carroll County? Frederick did not turn into, bedlam when they had the MARC train. What it did create was an opportunity for families to live in an area and not have a horrific commute and not have widening roads. And it's so much better for our environment. And after the recent UN report that's been released this week, I don't see how we can make any decision on transportation and not factor that in if we want this world to be here for our kids and our grandkids. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Omar.
A lot of people, when they talk about public transportation, they talk about it as if it is a failure if it does not pay for itself. We see this with the DC Metro, with the ridership rates falling because of the lack of reliability, because of not maintaining the infrastructure. So the Metro is currently not paying for itself, and people are using this as an argument against public transportation. And I think what we're not seeing is the investment in the future infrastructure of our state. We can keep building our roads, and we'll have to, because pretty much everyone in our state has to have a car to get around, unless they live in the DC area and they commute on the DC Metro. If you live in the city, you can use the buses. They are not always the most reliable system of public transportation. So right now, our entire economy depends on cars and commuters, and that's terrible for our environment, and it's terrible for our future. We need to invest in statewide public, and I mean public, in the sense that it goes to all of the counties and not just the inner city of Baltimore, where we currently have the one metro line that our state has. So we need to invest in public transportation in all of the counties, at least bus lines that get us from the train stations to the train stations.
Okay, thank you. All right, Ms. Shank, we'll start with you on this one and kind of piggybacking on something a couple of you were saying about the environment. Talk about the Chesapeake Bay for a minute. Do you believe that the state is doing enough to adequately protect the Chesapeake Bay, or do you think that current environmental regulations are too stringent? Please explain your position and what you would do differently, if anything.
I think we can always be doing more. And again, not to bring it up back to back, but I'm going to. The UN report that just came out should alarm every single one of us. We do not have any more time to mess around. We have to get serious. And it's beyond the Chesapeake Bay. We need to make sure that we're increasing our oyster counts and our crab counts, and we're opposed to offshore drilling. But it's also using renewable energy. There is a town in Texas, the name of which eludes me, that every single building runs off solar energy, the entire town. And the governor did it. He said the environment was the silver lining for him, but it was less expensive. This was a Republican governor. This is a bipartisan issue because our environment needs to be there, our world needs to be there for all of our kids. And if it is less expensive, it is better for the environment. Why we are not considering those things are beyond me. So I think we need to be more aggressive with that. More aggressive with wind farms. And of course, all of the protections that we have for the Chesapeake Bay.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Omar.
So this issue actually segues in with unrestricted development, because a lot of what happens in the Chesapeake Bay is runoff from areas that don't have proper erosion protection, runoff from overdeveloped areas, and runoff from farms that are near the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So I think in order to protect the Chesapeake Bay, we need more funding towards making our development in the state of Maryland ecologically sustainable so that it isn't running off. All of the flooding that's happened in Ellicott City is the perfect example lately of what happens when we have unrestricted development without making it ecologically sustainable. And this runoff goes directly to the Chesapeake Bay. I do think our DNR is doing a pretty good job of identifying areas that are at risk and need protecting. But if we're not going to pay attention to how our development is affecting our environment and how the runoff is affecting the bay, then we aren't going to know until 10 years too late.
Okay, thank you. Senator Reedy.
The Chesapeake Bay Foundation just scored the Chesapeake Bay at the healthiest it's been in decades, which is exciting news. Still, obviously, has a lot of challenges with it. When we talk about how we can clean up the Chesapeake Bay, one of the best things we could do would be to dredge the Conowingo Dam area. That right there would improve the health of the bay exponentially, and I'm going to tell you why. For all the work we've done, and actually Carroll County, many people don't know this, Carroll County actually is at the forefront of stormwater runoff remediation. We do a phenomenal job. We're like years ahead of most of the other jurisdictions. In fact, back when the famous rain tax was passed, our delegation was able to work together with the Governor O'Malley's MDE to give us an exception to paying the rain tax because we were so far ahead of where we needed to be. Our commissioners at that time even offered to help out Baltimore because when we talk about what pollutes the bay the most, runoff from the city of Baltimore and again, urban areas and areas near the critical area, that's the big challenge along with the Conowingo Dam. When there's a tropical storm that blows through, you get more silt and nitrates and other things running over the Conowingo Dam in 5 minutes than any amount of millions of dollars of spending on remediating stormwater runoff in suburban counties out like Carroll County. So Governor Hogan's actually been driving a pretty hard bargain to get serious about getting the Conowingo Dam dredged, and there's a lot of complexities behind that and what's going on with that. But that to me is what's critically important. I think every Marylander that cares about our state wants a clean Chesapeake Bay. Actually, we've done a lot to remediate runoff in the state. So there's a point where you can keep doing a thimble, or we can look at what's the spigot. And the spigot is the Conowingo Dam and the Conowingo River, and also continue to clean up those failing wastewater treatment plants in places like in Baltimore. That's another critical component of that.
Okay, thank you. All right, Ms. Omar, we'll start with you on this one. This is another question that was emailed in ahead of the forum. What is your stance on the statement that healthcare is a human right, and what do you believe is the best solution to ensuring that all Marylanders have access to quality healthcare?
Good question. I do believe that healthcare is a human right. I think that people underestimate how much healthcare underlying our employment law, underlying our environment, underlying our ability of teachers to teach, your ability to go out on a Saturday night and have a good time. if we do not have things like paid time off, health care, maternity leave, all of these things that fall under the healthcare as a human right umbrella, then it affects every tiny little area of everybody's life, and that includes the economy of the state. So I do believe healthcare is a human right, and I think we have the infrastructure in place in this state to start bringing single-payer healthcare to the state of Maryland. It's going to take a while, it's going to take some money, but I think it'll change everything for the better if we do that. So yes, I do believe healthcare is a human right, and I'd like to see it here in Maryland.
Okay, thank you. Senator Reedy.
Sometimes that question is interesting because the idea that health care is a human right, in Maryland, everyone has access to health care. No hospital can ever turn you away for care. Now, obviously, when we talk about health care, we want people to be getting checkups and maintaining their health. But health care itself, yes, you can get, there is no hospital in the state that will turn you away. And we actually have an all-payer system so that there's access to care for everyone. Health insurance may not be a human right. And some people say, well, what's the difference? Well, that's part of the problem we have in our entire healthcare system, is that I can't go purchase, as just a regular consumer, can't go purchase health care and say to the doctor, how much is this? And I will pay this much. And let me compare your price with somebody else. You can't do that because it's all the insurance companies that negotiate with the doctor, and you're like out of the equation. It's a big problem. That's more of maybe a nationwide discussion. But I was reading an interesting article just a couple days ago on Twitter, which sometimes getting on Twitter can be good or bad, depending on what you find there. But I actually read an article from Vox, which is known to be a left of center publication. They were talking about the explosion of healthcare premiums in the last 10 years. And I said to myself, what change has happened? What major policy change has happened that was going to fix everything, that was going to be the government being more involved in our healthcare? Well, it was Obamacare. So if you think Obamacare has worked out well, and I know some people say, hey, we don't want to get rid of Obamacare until we have something to substitute for it, and I think we should probably mostly get rid of Obamacare, but I understand that argument. But if you think Obamacare is not working all that well, I'm not sure we want to go to the next step of the government just trying to run everything, which when we say the government pays for it, it means you pay for it. You're paying for it one way or the other. So healthcare, the right to have access to care, we want everybody to have access to care. And in Maryland, you will not be turned away for care by anybody, by any hospital. But obviously, that's the low standard. We would like to make health insurance more affordable. Governor Hogan's done some really good work, and we worked with him in the General Assembly to try to stabilize insurance rates. But the answer is not more government. The answer is not more government involvement in health care.
Thank you. Ms. Shank.
I do believe that healthcare is a human right. I also believe that from a practical standpoint, it just makes more sense for us to have universal healthcare here in Maryland. So there's a few things that I think need to be touched on with this. We see several problems coming up because we don't have universal health care. Recently, retirees of the state of Maryland learned that their prescription drug coverage was going to be moved from the Maryland plan to Medicare Part D. Now, that can be a whole separate other debate on why that happened and how it was handled and all of that. If we had universal health care, we would not have 30,000 Marylanders right now worrying if their prescription drug costs alone are going to go up $10,000 a year. Now, Senator Reedy brings up the ACA, Obamacare. And the ACA was imperfect. It certainly, here in Maryland, gave some Marylanders insurance in name only. And that is a problem. It is not the fix. You can have an insurance card, but if your premium or your deductible is too high, then in reality, you don't have insurance. And because of federal gutting of the ACA, in Maryland, we were left with 2 insurers who then, because of the ambiguity at the federal level, had to continually raise their prices. It's not sustainable. But to suggest that everyone has access to health care because you can walk into a hospital is, frankly, I think, insulting to those who are really struggling financially. You may be able to walk into that hospital, but how are you going to manage that $100,000 medical bill at the end of it? And so I think we have to come up with a universal health care solution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Senator Reedy, we'll start with you on this one, and actually, a question I had in here, but we'll ask it now since piggybacking off what Ms. Shank just said. Let's talk about the shift in prescription drug coverage for retirees from the state of Maryland to the state plan to the Medicare Part D plan. What is your stance on that, and if reelected, how would you address it?
So this affects state retirees and potentially in the future, people who do retire from state service or when we talk about state service, I don't mean politicians, I mean any state employee. In 2011, this change was apparently, as I've done the research to look into exactly how it ended up where I'm going to say, it was part of a negotiation with reforming the pension system between the public sector unions and the O'Malley administration. And then this change was inserted into a very large bill, which I voted against, called the BRFA in 2011. It was my first session, actually, and that's a tandem bill that goes with the state budget bill every year. It basically is changes formulas to help make sure the budget bill is actually balanced, because we have to balance our budget every year in the state of Maryland. At least for one day, it has to be balanced. And so that passed. The idea, I believe at the time was, I voted against it, but the idea at the time was that by the time we get to 7 years from now, always dangerous when government does something, it says it'll take effect in 7 years, because a lot changes in 7 years. It's 7 years from now that there will be the Medicare Part D, there will be a federal solution to move these people to. The reason it was done financially actually wasn't totally like nefarious or anything. It's like a $45 million a year benefit, and it's something that private sector employers have gone away from years and years and years ago. So the idea was it was part of a negotiation, but then it was snuck in. I think state employees didn't know about it. Frankly, most of us voting on that bill didn't necessarily know that that's what that meant and that's what was in there. It's part of a long list of things in the bill. I voted against that BRFA bill because it was stuffed full of those kind of fee increases I talked about earlier, and it was just a fiscally irresponsible budget, clearly. So it's something that now Governor Hogan has stepped up, and actually he's worked with the two presiding officers in the Senate and the House to try to come up with a sort of a stopgap solution. As I talk to constituents, it doesn't seem to be doing enough to meet their concerns. I think in the 2019 session, there's going to be an effort to try to fix that issue. I don't think we should necessarily go back to it, but for people who plan their retirement around that, we need to try to find a solution to help them.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Shank.
So the shift in prescription drugs, as Senator Reedy was saying, did stem from the 2011 agreement to try and deal with our pension fund. And my concern is in part how retirees were informed. So I have not read the letter, but reporting says that the letter, rather than explaining to retirees the best way for them to go and, because open enrollment is starting soon, enroll in Medicare Part D, there was more information on who was to blame, whether it was the O'Malley administration or the Democrats in the legislature, or both. I'm not sure how that helps a confused, alarmed retiree who now is wondering how they're supposed to pay for their prescriptions. Now, a stopgap was passed so that any prescription costs over $1,500 out of pocket is covered, but it is not enough. And this is why we need universal health care. This right here, so that we don't end up having pensioners, retirees who counted on that, who considered that benefit as part of what they were working for, part of their salary, now wondering, are they going to pay? I read an article where one woman was deciding whether she was going to pay for her medication or her husband's, because paying for both was not an option. So it is something that will have to be addressed, because as it stands, we can't continue with this.
Thank you. Ms. Omar.
I hate to echo what Emily said, but I think this is a perfect example of why we need universal health care in the state of Maryland. We're constantly looking for cost-cutting measures on our individual pieces of our employee pension plans or our senior drug coverage or any of these things. This is why we will actually end up saving money if we simply, across the board, figure out how to cover all of these things for all citizens of the state of Maryland, instead of picking them one at a time and trying to put them all in a very confusing, complex bill that balances them all at once. And that's kind of impossible eventually. So yeah, I think this is a perfect example of why we need universal coverage in the state of Maryland, so that everybody knows and everybody can plan on what their retirement is, who's going to be ending up paying for the health insurance, and people don't have to worry about taking jobs based on the health insurance that they're going to have. I know that many of our seniors do end up taking jobs for health insurance reasons because they only have Medicare's Part A and B, and they can't afford Medicare Part D or other parts of Medicare. So again, this is a perfect example of why we need universal health care in the state of Maryland.
Thank you. All right, Ms. Shank, we'll start with you on this question. How would you describe Maryland's business climate, and what effects does it have, positive or negative, on Carroll County? And if elected, what would you do to help create more good-paying jobs in Maryland and Carroll?
So my focus is always on how are we growing small business. I am the daughter of a small business owner. My dad has had his own business for as long as I can remember. And I watched as a child him trying to grow his business in a responsible way, grow it enough that we had food on the table and new shoes to wear to school, but not so fast that he then wouldn't be able to keep up with demand. And that is tough. And when we put regulations on business and we don't keep the small business owner in mind, we make their job even harder. And I think that that is one of the most important things, that any regulation on business has to bring small business to the table and not conflate them with big business. Now, the other side of that is people need to be able to afford to live here. And that means paying a living wage, and that means having things like paid time off. And the studies show areas that pay a living wage, where there is paid maternity or paternity leave, there is better retention, there is less turnover, and at the end of the day, that is actually better for business. That saves business money. It has to be done thoughtfully in concert with them, but it does benefit business. And when we have businesses growing and we don't have barriers to entry, and we have a workforce that can afford to live where they're working and be in that same area, and can afford to go back to work after having children, because I'm not even gonna get started on the cost of childcare. All the parents are chuckling. That is how we improve our economy here.
Thank you. Ms. Omar.
I don't think I can say it better than that. I agree with everything Emily just said.
Okay. Senator Reedy.
What's the business climate in Maryland? I'd say it's improving. We still have a ways to go. I'm very proud of having a A rating with small business voting record, to try to always keep in mind the idea that the people who are not just the job creators themselves, but the people that work for those small businesses, we got to be mindful. Everything that's happening in state government as it relates to the economy and job market, as it relates to regulations on business, you have to think about how that impacts the employees and the people who not just own the business, but the people who are invested in those businesses. It's true, and actually Emily makes a great point, that the big corporations, a lot of times they can handle a little bit more regulation, because it's just maybe they just got to pay a lawyer a few more hours, or they've got to add just one more employee to their compliance staff at each store, you know. But if you're running a landscaping company or a pizza place, or you're trying to get ahead, even if you have maybe you have a couple of businesses that are bigger but still under, say, 100 employees, or even under 20 or 25 employees, it becomes a real hardship. So what we have done, I think, the last 4 years, one of the things that's gone a little bit maybe unrecognized in the sort of the press that Governor Hogan's been able to accomplish, is something I was always frustrated with when I was a delegate and in the state senate, is people just want to get answers when they're trying to work in business, when they're trying to grow their business, when they're trying to decide whether they want to invest and build out or hire some more people, and they need answers from state agencies. Governor Hogan's introduced a customer service mindset to our state agencies. Sometimes it isn't passing more laws or getting rid of laws even. It may just be getting answers, straight answers, more quickly. And the Governor Hogan's administration has really made a focus of that. I think it's been great. But there's no question right now our tax climate and our regulatory climate is still not competitive in the Mid-Atlantic. I'm not here telling you we have to have Oklahoma's tax rates. but I think we ought to at least get competitive with Virginia and Pennsylvania and Delaware, and try to find ways that we can compete better for keeping businesses here and growing more jobs.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll start with Ms. Omar for this one. Do you agree or disagree that Maryland should have an independent, nonpartisan body draw the legislative and congressional district maps, and would you support legislation to do so?
I do agree, and I would support legislation to do so. Gerrymandering is a huge problem in many states, and I really think that we need nonpartisan commissions in every state, not just Maryland, although as state legislators, we don't have the power to do that, to draw these lines in a way that is fair and a way that makes sense.
Thank you. Senator Reedy.
I agree. I do support it. I have co-sponsored a bill to do that in a couple of years, and I strongly support it. I think this is a great example of the Annapolis machine at work. They have politicians picking their voters. And it is true that it happens in other states, and both parties' hands are certainly not clean on the issue of gerrymandering, there's no question. I will say Maryland's congressional districts are especially egregious because there are states that you see in other parts of the country where you'll see a weird-looking congressional district that looks absurd, and it is absurd. But a lot of times those are done because they have to meet a certain level of, like maybe a certain minority population has to be at the majority in that district, so it's still gerrymandering, but they're doing it for a purpose. Here in Maryland, the two worst, squiggliest looking districts, that's not the reason they're that way. It's just because like one congressman wanted to have all the military bases in his district, and another congressman wanted to have University of Maryland College Park in his district, but not much of the other area. It's just basically politicians picking their voters, and it's wrong. So I agree. We agree on this one. There's no difference between the two candidates on this one. We both support nonpartisan independent redistricting.
Okay, Ms. Shank.
Oh, absolutely. We have to redistrict Maryland on a state and a federal level, and it has to be nonpartisan. We are one of the most gerrymandered states in the country, and my husband loves to tell me what the rating is. I can't remember if it's the third or the second. But we absolutely have to change that. I mean, even if you look at District 5, right, at our district that we're all running in, it is almost all of Carroll County, but we've carved out a little Mount Airy, and we've carved out a little Sykesville. And the truth is that people in Sykesville have the same interests and goals and needs as people in Eldersburg or Westminster. They're from Carroll County. They have Carroll County concerns. And how much attention do you think they're getting from Howard County? How much attention is Mount Airy getting from Frederick? We absolutely have to redraw them. It has to be done by a nonpartisan, non-political body. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think that's the first time you guys have all agreed tonight, right? Let's see if we can ask something that'll change that up. All right, Second Amendment rights. Let's see how this goes if you all agree. Let's talk about Second Amendment rights. Always a hot topic. What is one piece of legislation related to firearms that you would pursue if elected? And we'll start with Senator Reedy.
I think for the safety of residents in the city of Baltimore and around the state, we need to become a state where if you're a law-abiding citizen and you pass extensive background checks and submit to extensive training requirements, I believe that self-defense is a good and substantial reason to be able to have a concealed carry permit. In cities where in places where they allow this, crime tends to drop. But I also just think it's ultimately a freedom issue that, again, have to be law-abiding citizen, no criminal record. I don't mind if we put in place tons and tons of extra training on top of what we have now to get the bill passed. But I think Maryland has this weird way that we seem to be afraid of legal gun owners, but yet we tolerate, I don't tolerate it, but we have an attorney general, and we have a state, Brian Frosch, and we have a state's attorney in Baltimore City, and we have elected officials in Baltimore City particularly, and other places in the state where there's a lot of violence that seem to be like, they seem to be okay with people getting second, third, and fourth chances on gun crime, but they're all for taking away my neighbor's ability to get a handgun to defend themselves if they want to. So that's what I would support, and I have supported it, and I'll continue to.
Okay, Ms. Shank.
In Maryland, we have we have a law that technically requires gun owners to lock up their guns, but it has no real teeth. And so the one change, if I'm picking one, the one change that I would make would be to put teeth in that law. 54% of otherwise law-abiding gun owners don't lock up their guns. And I will point out, though, that by not locking them up, they're no longer law-abiding. Here's the problem. Every year, 500 children die by gun suicide. 500. 5,800 result in injuries, and 1,300 deaths by kids accessing guns that they should have never been able to access. So here's what the Maryland law says. The Maryland law says if a gun owner fails to lock up their gun and it is accessed by a child, which for purposes of this law is defined as under the age of 16, it is a misdemeanor and a $1,000 fine. And it explicitly does not create any criminal or civil liability. Well, I have a problem with that. When my children are going over to someone's house for a play date, I ask, do you have any guns and are they locked up? If they're locked up, I don't care what's in that safe, but they better be locked up. Now, I had a voter, we were having a debate on this, and he said, how am I supposed to defend my family if my gun has to be locked up? Fair question. I am not a home security expert, and so I'm not going to sit there and tell you other ways, because I also recognize that part of the Second Amendment is to protect your home with that gun. But it is not fair to place that burden on children who could then access it. And so that is the one law I would change. I would put real teeth in it.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Omar.
I think the thing that we don't talk about enough when we're talking about gun ownership is domestic violence. And I was very glad to see last legislative session that we passed the law that takes the guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. That being said, I don't think we do enough to recognize the history of domestic violence in gun crime, because if you look at the histories of a lot of these shooters that we've had over the past couple years, if you go back even just a little bit, it all starts with domestic violence. So I think if we want to really get our hands around gun crime, we need to go and look closer into domestic violence crime. We need to do more to criminalize this. We need to hold people accountable. We need to pass more laws and give law enforcement more tools to recognize and prosecute these crimes. And then we need to use the law that already exists to take the guns away from people who are domestic violence perpetrators. And I think that's going to solve a lot of our problems when it comes to gun crimes, because this is a precursor to a lot of gun crimes. If you look at the research that has been allowed to be done, it all starts with domestic violence, and we can stop it there. We don't have to wait until it gets to taking away people's guns. I don't want to take away the guns of, happy Joe Hunter in Carroll County, of course. That's a part of life just up here, going deer hunting in the season. So really, we need to make sure that we're focusing in on the population of people who are actually causing these crimes. And that population of people increasingly are the people who also perpetrate crimes of domestic violence.
Okay, thank you. All right, Ms. Shank, we'll start with you on this one. Regarding school safety, do you believe the state has provided adequate funding for jurisdictions like Carroll County to improve school safety, whether that's related to infrastructure improvements, be it metal detectors or what have you, or funding for additional school resource officers?
So last year, when Governor Hogan passed the Safe Schools Act, it did provide for, I think, some things that we were able to then improve here in Carroll County. We now have a student resource officer that is in every high school and will be in additional schools and moving forward. Studies have shown that school resource officers, when they are present, there's actually fewer fights that break out, there's a decrease in detention, and I know some of our sheriff's deputies, and they are phenomenal, and with the training that they go through, I think it is an excellent step, and I do support that. There is no way that the amount of money, though, that was allocated in the Safe Schools Act is going to harden every building, every school in the state. And studies have also shown that what may make adults feel better, metal detectors, sometimes makes children feel less safe. And it doesn't necessarily actually make them safer. So I think the way we go about hardening our schools is something that we need to do in a very thoughtful and deliberate way instead of a reactionary way. What I would like to see are crisis counselors. And right now, we do have crisis counselor, crisis groups that will be working at a district of schools. So our district will have so many, and they'll each have a school. And it's made up of a teacher, of a crisis counselor, of law enforcement. And so I think that's a really good start. That's the kind of thing that if we expand it, I think will actually make our schools safer.
Thank you. Ms. Omar.
If you ask any security expert, and I believe they actually did a study on this for the Board of Education, our previous administrator, Stephen Guthrie, it turns out that the biggest security hole in any security system, whether school resource officers or pressing a button to get in, is simply people's friendliness and willingness to open the door for the person behind them. And I don't think any amount of money thrown at this problem is going to solve that, because it's simply, we're friendly here. I mean, it's Carroll County, we're just friendly up here. So what we actually need is more community awareness, and the funding needs to go towards teaching people good security measures, and not necessarily towards putting more buttons on the school doors or funding more school resource officers, because these things are not shown to have as much effectiveness in school security as simply good security practices. And so we need to all, as a community, learn more about good security practices in order to keep our schools safer.
Thank you. Senator Reedy.
When 9/11 happened, we saw a dramatic sea change in how we view airport security. Some of that has been good and some of that has not been good in execution, and it's the butt of a lot of jokes. But the temperament and the way we look at airline flight now changed. It's changed forever. So much of the debate over things that have happened with the school shootings relative to firearms and firearm laws, it really kind of sweeps, that's kind of what the focus is. But we've taken it in the General Assembly, actually, and this has been a bipartisan effort to take it very seriously. We need to look at securing our schools. We had to actually fight a little bit. Our delegation, particularly Delegate Rose and Delegate Shoemaker, and myself and Senator Huff, had to really fight in both the Senate and the House to be sure that the money that was being made available for SROs, school resource officers, was available to counties like ours that were already doing some of it, or where the county was the main funder, and we did that. There was a resistance to putting more money towards school construction that would be allocated towards security. And I think some of it may be the idea that we don't want to rush into doing a whole bunch of like barbed wiring and all that kind of stuff and scaring kids. I think that's a fair point. At the same time, we really need to look at, these are our most precious commodities. My wife is a public school teacher. My daughter is in an elementary school in the county. And it's very concerning. So I think, actually, probably we somewhat agree on what we've talked about with what Emily was saying. I think we may be kind of on the same page in that one of the problems in public policy, anytime you have a big crisis, is that there's not like we sometimes don't do a good job of saying, okay, here's what we could do, but we need to look at the pros and cons of everything. I do think we need to get very serious about changing the way we look at school construction, though. We do need to make our schools more secure. I don't know that maybe metal detectors is the answer. Maybe it's not. I think there are specialists that we can look at. I know there's a lot of exciting technology out there that can really secure a school much more effectively for not that much money than we're doing now. So I think that's got to be a real focus moving forward, is securing our schools. These are our most precious commodities that we have as our children.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll do two more questions and then wrap things up. Ms. Omar, we'll start with you on this one. And simply put, whom do you support for governor in the upcoming election and why?
I support Ben Jealous for governor in the upcoming election. I believe that he is our best bet at getting a living wage and universal health care in the state of Maryland. And as we've already discussed, I believe those two things are very important for all kinds of things, especially poverty alleviation in our public schools.
Thank you. Senator Reedy.
I support Governor Larry Hogan for re-election, and I will tell you, if you're a voter watching this, no matter what party you're in and you live in Carroll County, you will never get you're not going to get a better deal for the county than working for Governor Hogan. Whether you're conservative, even if you're someone watching this and you're like, there's no way I'm voting for you, Reedy, you're way too conservative. Even if you're someone who would call yourself a progressive liberal, Governor Hogan has watched out for our county, and he's given us he's worked with us on a number of key funding issues and a number of other key things that are very, very important. He's really looked out for our county in a way that wouldn't have happened. And no matter what somebody may tell you, it wouldn't matter whether you're a Democrat delegate, Republican delegate, Democrat senator, Republican senator. When it's a different governor in office, a different party, they are not going to have Carroll County's back the way Governor Hogan has. So I could go through a whole litany of things I think are wonderful accomplishments for the governor and what he's trying to accomplish and the things that we want to try to do together moving forward. But I think bottom line is he's really had Carroll County's back, and I'm proud to support him.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Shank.
So one of my big concerns as I've started to run, and I have watched, and we've all watched, the tribalism and the partisan dysfunction that can happen. And I am committed to not being part of that problem and to being part of that solution. To that end, I want to be able to have a great working relationship with Governor Hogan or a Governor Jealous, whoever that may be. Now, a political role model for me is the Comptroller Peter Franchot. And actually, I was honored to get his endorsement because I take a people over party approach. And I think his attitude of not endorsing, so that way he can have a strong working relationship with whoever ends up being the governor, I think that that is the approach I'm going to take as well, because I look forward to having a good, whether it's a bipartisan working relationship with Governor Hogan or a relationship with Governor Jealous where I'm working bipartisanly with my co-delegates.
Okay, thank you. All right, last question before we do the summary statement, and we'll start with Senator Reedy. If elected, in your case re-elected, what is the one piece of legislation that we haven't discussed at some point here tonight, already tonight, that would be personally important to you that you would pursue in this year's legislative session, and why?
It's a great question, and it's actually a bill I'm very excited about. I hope I'll get a chance to work on it. I did put it in this year, and I'm going to be reintroducing it. Maryland is one of only a few states that doesn't protect pregnant women in the sense of if they are murdered with a baby with a baby before 20 weeks, that you can't prosecute for the death of both the fetus and the woman. And even states like California, if you think about the political side, we've heard a little bit about tribalism. Not even a state like California has protections for if someone in cold blood knowingly murders a woman who's pregnant, and it can be proven they knew it and they did it, that you can prosecute for both murders. I put the bill in to change Maryland's law so that we could do that. It was based around a terrible situation in Howard County with a teacher that was murdered by a boyfriend who did it because she was pregnant. It's clear as day, but the baby, Reed, was 14 weeks old at the time, and so they could only, the state's attorney could only prosecute for one murder. You may say, well, if it's going to be life in prison, what does it matter whether they prosecute for one or two murders? It matters to the victims and it matters to their families. And many times people plead down. So having 2 life sentences hanging over you, it's a lot harder to plead down from that. So that's a bill I plan to put in again. It actually had bipartisan support, but it did not pass because of some issues, frankly, relative to some of the tribalism and the machine politics we're talking about. And so we're going to try to see if we can adjust the bill a little bit and get it over that hurdle. But that's definitely something very important to me and to my family and to some people that I was honored to meet and get to know. So I'm going to be putting that bill in if I'm fortunate enough to go back.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Shank.
I would introduce term limits. I have pledged to only serving 2 terms in the House of Delegates. Every single voter that I speak to wants term limits. Every single voter can point to someone who is in office who has been there for too long. And what often happens, I think we get these politicians and they're good and their constituents like them, and so they keep going back. But no one no one can keep doing that without becoming part of a machine, without becoming tribalistic. And I think that is a big part of why we're seeing that right now. You know, we term limit our presidents, we term limit our commissioners, we term limit our school board. It only makes sense that we term limit our legislators as well. And it creates another benefit. So instead of having someone who has held a leadership position for decades, that baton gets passed on to the next generation of leaders in that party, the next generation that will work with other leaders in the other parties. And that is how we get government that truly works for the people. And so not only am I committing to that myself, we have to make that a law. And so I will introduce that legislation. I'm not naive. I know it will get pushback from my own party, but that is why the activist in me is why you're going to send me, because I will fight for it and we will make that law because it's what the voters want.
Thank you. Ms. Omar.
I think I've already stated what my most important piece of legislation is, but again, just to reiterate, that's going to be the $15 minimum wage for the state of Maryland. Over a series of years, we can keep increasing the minimum wage until it hits something approximating a living wage in the state of Maryland. This is going to help everybody in the state. It's going to increase everybody's purchasing power. It's going to help the housing market because people will be able to afford to live in places like Carroll County again. This is going to help all of those families whose children may be going to school and may be part of that at-risk student population. It's going to help them take care of their families, so it's going to help our public schools. This just helps so many different areas across the board that it just makes sense to get it in there. So $15 minimum wage, that's my bill.
Okay, thank you. All right, at this time, we'll go through our summary statements, and we'll start again at the head of the table with Ms. Shank and conclude with Senator Reedy.
Well, thank you again to the Carroll County Times and the Community Media Center, to my colleagues up here. It has been a really enjoyable evening. I think I have gotten a chance to share my vision with the voters, and I have tried to be as transparent as I can be. If anyone has any questions or follow-up, I would encourage them to go to my website, emilyshankfordelegate.com. You can reach out. I try to be very responsive. And you can reach out if you agree or disagree, and I look forward to conversations. Unfortunately, I don't think I can say that about our current delegation who chose to not be here tonight. I don't know what their vision is. I don't know if voters do. I don't know what goals they have for the next 4 years because they chose to not be here. Now, I am proud to have been endorsed by the Teachers Association, by Comptroller Franchel, by 2 labor unions and 2 environmental groups, and I would really encourage voters to look at that research and look at my website and reach out. And I would thank you for your vote on November 6th.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Omar.
I think it's pretty clear that I come here to represent a more progressive vision for the state of Maryland, and I'm glad you've given me the opportunity to do that, so thank you to the Carroll County Times and the Community Media Center. A vote for me is a vote for progressive politics like universal health care and a $15 minimum wage and increases in public transportation. So I would like to take everybody from the bottom up and help lift everybody in the state, and not just people who are already doing okay here in Carroll County, but people who are maybe not doing so okay here in Carroll County and the rest of the state. So if you'd like to vote for me on November 6th, I would really appreciate it, and you can get in touch with me via my Facebook page on Facebook.
Okay, thank you. Senator Reedy.
Thank you, and Wayne, thank you for your excellent moderation of this discussion tonight. To Emily and Jamie both, I think we have had a very good discussion about a number of issues. I just ask, as people look at the upcoming election, to think very clearly about the direction we want our state to go. You know, my vision for Maryland is making our state a place where families and businesses can afford to live, to stay, to thrive. We want to keep our retirees here. We want to continue to make progress working with Governor Hogan to make our state really the destination on the East Coast for businesses and for families and retirees. It's been such an honor to serve in the state Senate. When I've gone in each day, when we're down in session, it's a humbling experience to know that I'm there to speak on your behalf. And sometimes we agree and sometimes we may disagree, but I hope you'll find that I've always had an open ear, always willing to listen. I look forward to talking with anyone who has any questions. You can reach me on justinreedy.com or on my Facebook page, which is /Senator Reedy. Again, as you look to the election, it's a critical choice about the future of our state. Which direction are we going to go? Are we going to go in a direction where we believe government knows best and that every problem that comes up is something we need to throw more taxpayer dollars at and the government decides? Or is it something where we have more economic freedom, more opportunity for people to make their own decisions? And I think that's a clear choice. So I look forward to the rest of the campaign, and I ask for your vote on November 6th. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And just thank you again to all the candidates who attended here tonight and for the Community Media Center for hosting this forum. With that said, I'll turn things back over to our host, Judge Charles Harrison.
Thank you, Wayne. Appreciate it. On behalf of the Media Center, I would like to thank all of the candidates who joined us this evening, our moderator, Mr. Wayne Carter with the Carroll County Times, our live audience, who did a terrific job for us this evening, and everyone who submitted questions for the candidates tonight. Coverage of the Commissioners' Candidates Forum will be rebroadcast on cable channel 19 and 23 starting on Tuesday, October the 16th, and will be available for on-demand viewing on the Community Media Center website at carrollmediacenter.org. Before we leave tonight, I just want to encourage everyone to get out and vote on November the 6th. Remember, voting isn't just a right, it is a responsibility, and every vote counts. So please, take the time to learn about all of the candidates who are running in the general election and be sure to cast your vote on November the 6th. Thank you all and good night.